Canada's Immigration Department is not keeping up with the demand for investigations into fraudulent student visa holders. That's according to an audit by Canada's Auditor General that found over 150,000 cases were flagged from 2023 to 2024. Only 4,000 investigations were launched into that activity. Among those, only 1,600 were marked as inconclusive because the student in question stopped responding. Here is what the minister had to say ahead of QP today.
So we will be centralizing the investigation. We will be streamlining anyone that is flagged. We will be doing more reporting, and we will be information sharing with CBSA of any students that are not compliant or that are not currently students.
Here to tell us more is Auditor General Karen Hogan. Thanks for coming on. Nice to see you.
Thanks for inviting me.
So your report raises some serious questions, I think, about the international student program. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of it for me is that the department may be turning or may have turned a blind eye to fraud. You identified 800 cases of outright fraud, and the department, you found, did not consider acting in any of those instances. What does that say about how Ottawa is handling this file?
I think the first thing I'd want to say is that the department actually identified those 800 cases and then did not consider doing anything about it. And that's why one of the most concerning findings is how they're not acting on the information that they have. I would have expected here that they would have put a flag on a file or canceled a permit or done something so that when these individuals may apply for other permits, that they would apply some rigor at that point. But what we found is the majority of those 800 went on to apply for another permit, and about 50% of them have been approved since.
And there could be potentially more cases of fraud because we know that, let's focus on another number, 150,000. That's how many students were flagged by their schools as potentially being non-compliant with some of the student permit conditions. The department, you found, investigated fewer than 4,000 of those more than 150,000 students. That kind of seems to me like a free-for-all situation, right? There's not really a lot of oversight going on here in terms of folks who maybe not fulfilling some of the conditions they have to meet. How would you characterize the oversight in those cases?
So again, it's one of those cases of not acting on the information that they had. So I think here the department told us that because of budget constraints, they could only investigate 2,000 a year. So then I would have expected lots of rigor in those 4,000 investigations that they did. But what we saw was about 40% of them, they closed the file. Because the students stopped communicating with them. So again, there's lots of things in the Immigration Department's toolkit that they can use to address this, right? They can either put a flag on an individual's file so that when they apply for another permit, you can be alerted, or they could cancel the permit and then inform the Canada Border Services Agency so that together they can decide the best course of action. That's not happening when you're not sharing information or acting on the information you have.
Yeah, the other thing that stuck out to me was that the government doesn't really know how many international students are actually staying or going, right? They've kind of lost track of whether these students are still in Canada when the permit is over. Tell me what you found out about that, because it seems like hundreds of thousands of student permits are issued every year, but the department really struggled to identify just how many are still here in this country. Mm-hmm.
So your third question's about the next area of them not acting on information that they have. What we found is that they weren't making a list of how many students had expired permits. So my audit team worked with the Immigration Department, said let's come up with that list, and we narrowed it down to about 39,000 students that had not yet applied for any other immigration status. So we then went to the Canada Border Services Agency and said, help us determine whether or not these individuals left the country. And we found that in 40% of the cases, CBSA could confirm they had left the country. So now it's up to the Immigration Department and the Border Services to decide what to do with that little over 23,000 that are left. But I would expect that they will take some action in order to determine whether or not these students should continue to be here, or if they should apply for another status, or if they should be removed.
So the government, CBSA, doesn't know where those other 23,500 students have gone? They're just, it's
Well,
kind of a
they
black
had
hole?
no record of them leaving the country. So I think it is about, trying to communicate with them. And the Canada Border Service Agency couldn't do this on their own because the Immigration Department has the information. So they need to better collaborate and share. So we made that recommendation for them, and we gave the Immigration Department the work we did and said, here you go, you can repeat it and hopefully keep doing this on a regular basis to improve the integrity of the international student program.
I've read a lot of your reports over the years. I've read reports from your predecessors. This, frankly, to me, was one of the more damning ones. Literally, the conclusion, this is one sentence, and you say, we conclude that Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada was not effectively implementing reforms to the international student program. Not many more details than that needed, I guess. Do you have any confidence in the department to actually manage this file, given what you've uncovered about some of these incidents?
I think when you look back and look at what the reforms were meant to do, the key element of the reform was to reduce the number of temporary residents in the country in line with the immigration levels that had been decided. And a key element was reducing the number of international students. So a success in that they were able to do that, but the decline was so much sharper than they expected and resulted in some unintended consequences in some of the provinces. Some were expecting a 10% increase in permits, but saw a 60% decline. So I think this speaks to the need to collaborate with provincial counterparts and educational institutions to figure out if some of those reforms need to be adjusted. But then the integrity reforms are where I find they really are falling short. There's a lot of information they should be acting on to improve integrity, and we gave them recommendations, and I trust that they'll act swiftly on them.
So essentially their defense is that they didn't have enough money, manpower to keep track. I mean, I'm just going back to this 800 cases of fraud that you say they identified themselves, and they just let it happen. Like, it just seems kind of wild to me that a federal department would know that there's wrongdoing going on and they do essentially nothing about it. And then in some cases, they're applying for different immigration permits after the fact. Like, how do we even get to this point?
And I don't know if it's a matter of needing more funding. That was a decision made around how to allocate resources and only investigate 2,000 of the 153,000 students who were flagged as potentially non-compliant. What I would say is I expect the department will effectively use the resources it has now to see how much it can get through before it decides if it needs more resources to be able to protect the integrity of the program.
Let's talk about the RCMP, because you did a report on that today as well, looking at some of the critical recruitment shortages. One thing that stuck out to me was this idea that the force needs a certain number of frontline officers, and yet they're not coming anywhere close to recruiting and training and actually graduating folks to enter the force. In 24-25 fiscal year, the force needed 2,700 new frontline officers. The Mounties hired only 892, so well below what they needed. And actually the numbers are going to be even more lopsided this year based on what you found in your report. What's going on here? Why is the RCMP having such trouble with recruitment?
So it isn't a trouble with attracting applications. They receive thousands of applications, especially after they implemented a flexible posting plan that would allow police officers to pick where they would be assigned instead of being told where to go for their first posting. So it is about the length of time it takes to get through an application. I think that's one of the contributing factors. It takes over 330 days on average to process an application, which is well above their service standard of 224. They do things sequentially, and they're only passing through or making successful candidates in 6% of the cases. Then you get to what does that impact mean on training? Well, they have some capacity right now on training. Only 18% of their classes were at capacity, and in fact, they canceled some of them. So I think once they figure out how to increase how many they can bring in the system, they also can't lose sight on making sure that they have capacity going forward to train, because it is a good 6-month training period to get a police officer out there. So I think those are two key elements, but a basic one, as you started the question with, would be knowing what you need. And right now they're not thinking about all the vacancies. They're not thinking about attrition. And so we identified a few gaps in their workforce planning, and we hope that they'll consider those going forward.
Yeah, that number just is shocking, frankly. Only 6% of applicants actually go through the training and are trained to be a police officer and deployed as part of the Mounties. So that means the other 94% didn't work out for them. I mean, that's not a good success rate, right, in terms of the pipeline of people actually staffing up a force, meeting some of those shortages in communities where there has been these pervasive issues for a long time. That's an indictment, really, of how this whole thing works.
So I think you have to break down that donut in a slightly different way. There is a bunch of applications that are deemed unsuitable by the RCMP, and I would expect that no matter how hard you try to accelerate this process, that you will apply rigor. You want to have the right person being a police officer. They're expected to go run towards danger, so you want to make sure that you have the right person there. Where I think they need to focus their efforts is about the 40% of applicants who either withdraw from the process or stop communicating with the RCMP. And it's those where you'll ideally have some candidates in there that could become police officers. So I think focusing the efforts there, and many of them, we actually surveyed some of them, told us that it was how slow this process was or the lack of communication. So I think if they tackle those issues, they should see some successes in increasing hiring.
People can only wait so long, right, to get a job. Karen Hogan, Auditor General, thanks for coming in. Nice to see you.
Thank you.